The Little Drummer Boy by Eddie Robson. Performed by Beth Chalmers. "Who could become famous with a name like Bing Crosby?" said the man in the checkered suit and bowler hat. The old man with the long white hair nodded. A few feet away, a small boy stood and watched the two of them. He was intrigued by the tall blue box that stood behind them, though he didn't quite know why. The boy's name was Robert, and nobody had spotted him yet. He was on a movie set, from what he could make out. There were lots of movie people around, but they were all distracted with chasing around after the man in the shirt and tie and the lady with the black hair and black outfit. More people were gathering. Robert decided that he'd better leave. He vanished. A little later, the two people who everybody had been chasing entered the blue box. The old man went with them, and the box vanished too. An hour later, Sarah Kingdom returned to the TARDIS console room to find the Doctor asleep in the ornate chair in the corner. The other occupant of the time machine, Stephen Taylor, stood over the console, having changed out of his shirt and tie and into a sweater and slacks. His hair, ruffled by recent activities, was neatly combed back into its usual coiffure. He glanced up from the instruments at Sarah's approach. "You can get changed if you like," Stephen said. "The TARDIS has plenty of clothes." Sarah looked down at herself, clad in the black streamlined uniform of the Space Security Service, the uniform she'd been wearing since she joined the Doctor and Stephen in the TARDIS. Sarah just felt that she wanted something to remain constant, at least for a while. Although she presented a clinical facade, she was emotionally exhausted by the stress of recent events. Having initially been told that these two men threatened the safety of the galaxy, she then discovered that they were, in fact, probably its only chance of avoiding domination by the Daleks. That had required an adjustment on her part, as had fleeing the Daleks in their company whilst in possession of the Terranium core, the power source of the Daleks' greatest weapon. Then there was the disorienting effect of their recent landings, which had featured such colossal changes of pace and ambience that it almost made her nauseous. Was it always going to be like this? "No," she told Stephen. "No, I feel more comfortable as I am." Stephen raised his eyebrows. "Suit yourself. It just doesn't look all that comfortable to me." The atmosphere between them had suddenly become awkward. "Did you find a room?" he said, changing the subject. "Yes, thank you," she said. "The one just next to this will be fine, if nobody else is using it." "No," said Stephen. "No one's using it." He turned his attention back to the console. Sarah looked over at the Doctor. "Does he often do that?" she said, desperate to break the silence. "Do what?" asked Stephen. "Fall asleep during flight." Stephen looked up at the chair in the corner. "Not often, no. I don't think the sherry helped. He doesn't seem to drink much alcohol." "So he sometimes leaves you to fly the TARDIS?" Stephen laughed. "No, I can't fly the TARDIS. I'm not such a bad pilot, even if I say so myself, but it's way ahead of my time. Yours too, before you get in with some dig about my coming from a primitive era," he said pointedly. "I wasn't going to," Sarah said, although admittedly she would have been surprised if Stephen had been able to fly such an advanced craft. "Why are you watching the instruments if you can't fly the ship?" "Well, at first I wanted to learn," said Stephen, scratching his head. "But it's beyond me. Now it's just because I feel better if there's somebody at the controls, I suppose." Sarah folded her arms. "That doesn't make much sense." "Maybe not," Stephen said, and returned his attention to the instruments. "So," said Sarah, aware that this was not going well, "where are we heading?" "Who knows?" said the Doctor suddenly. Stephen and Sarah turned to see him yawn, stretch, and rise from his chair. "A few more random landings should ensure we have shaken off the Daleks, so to speak." "Random landings? I didn't know there was any other kind," said Stephen. "What do you mean?" "Well, We never know just where we're going to land, replied Stephen. Sarah turned to the doctor. Is that true? She asked, her chest tightening with a sting of panic. What if they couldn't get her home again? Said the doctor. Sheer poppycock. Pay no attention, my dear. Sarah was not entirely convinced, but there were other, more pressing matters. It is important, though, she said. Everything rests on our keeping the Terranium core away from the Daleks. We should be using the most efficient transport available. The doctor rounded on her indignantly, produced the Terranium core from his pocket, and gestured with it. My dear lady, he said, nobody is more aware than I of how important it is we keep hold of this piece of Terranium. And the TARDIS is most certainly the most effective escape craft available to us at the present time. Now, do you want to assist us or not? Of course, Sarah replied. It's my duty to protect the solar system, to protect the Terranium. If I have to come with you to do that, I will. Good, said the doctor, satisfied. And I should appreciate it if you wouldn't undermine me, my boy, he said, looking towards Stephen. He returned the Terranium to his pocket. Stephen nodded, apparently knowing when it was better not to argue. Oh, and for your information, the doctor added, alcohol has only a negligible effect on my constitution, and I have never slept through a landing. And the TARDIS landed. The doctor emerged from the ship first, followed by Stephen and Sarah. They had seen the snowy conditions on the scanner, and accordingly Stephen had donned a black overcoat. Sarah shivered briefly, but after a few seconds her uniform's temperature regulator adjusted itself to compensate. Their surroundings were Victorian and picturesque, comprising narrow streets of 3-story houses. There was a church nearby, and a substantial carpet of snow smothered the ground. The streets were all but empty. The doctor sniffed. He said, nonplussed. I had expected the TARDIS to take us further. This can't be more than a few decades earlier than where we were before. Looks like we're still on Earth, too, said Stephen. Yes, I'd say so, said the doctor, taking in the clothes and buildings. We appear to be in England, probably the 1880s. Not only that, said Stephen, but it's Christmas again. It had only been an hour or so since they had raised a toast to that occasion. Not that it meant much inside a time machine. The doctor looked around. I do believe you're quite correct. Yes, look there, he said, gesticulating at the trees that were visible in the windows of the surrounding homes. As if on cue, carols became audible from the church. Yes, my boy, that's quite a coincidence. Quite a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences, said Sarah. No, my dear, said the doctor. Neither do I. But it's possible that a random landing could have brought us here. Well, since we haven't travelled far, said Sarah, shouldn't we leave in case the Daleks have tracked us? Possibly. Quite possibly. I should like to find out the exact date, for my own records. Doesn't the TARDIS have a device for working that out? Asked Sarah. Well, it does, but you see it works in terms of absolute time. I do keep meaning to establish a formula to convert into Earth's local time. It ought to be a simple matter, really. The doctor seemed to drift into talking more to himself than anybody else. Given the correct data. A boy was walking their way. A child of no more than 8 years. A Dickensian street urchin, straight out of a George Cruikshank illustration. Under his misshapen hat, his hair was black and his eyes were blue. The doctor attracted the boy's attention, and the boy walked over to them. The doctor leaned over slightly to put himself closer to the boy's eye level. "Tell me, boy," said the doctor, "what day is this?" The boy smiled. "Why, sir," he said, "it's Christmas Day." "I see," the doctor replied. "And, could you tell me the year?" The boy looked amused, but asked no questions. "It's 1885, sir," he told them, and went on his way. "Thank you, young man," the doctor called after him. A few minutes later, the boy stood in a shop doorway and watched the TARDIS slowly disappear. A short while after that, he disappeared too. 4 landings later, the doctor was perplexed. The TARDIS had taken them to Christmases and Christmas Eves in 1982, 1946, 1931, and now a small Sussex village in 2069. Stephen and Sarah were still outside, but the doctor had returned to the ship to work on some calculations. The doctor looked up from his sheaf of notes, removed his glasses and shook his head. "No, it's no good," he said. "I can't see it. I can't see it at all." The doors opened and Stephen and Sarah returned. "Well, Doctor?" Stephen asked. "No, my boy. I'm afraid I can't work it out," the doctor replied. "Ever since I started feeding the TARDIS with random coordinates, we've been landing on Earth on Christmas Day, or just before it. And other than that, I can see no pattern to the landings." "What can we do?" asked Sarah. "As far as I can see, my dear, there isn't a great deal that we can do," replied the doctor. "As you yourself said before, we must keep moving in order to evade the Daleks. So..." He operated the dematerialization switch. Stephen stepped out of the TARDIS into a cold, grey atmosphere. The landscape was instantly familiar, though this was the first time he had seen it for himself. The TARDIS stood in a narrow ditch with muddy sides, and around the edge he could see barbed wire and rotting debris. Instinctively he expected to hear the sound of gunfire, but now that he actually listened for it, there was none. More than that, though, there was the unexpected sound of cheering and voices singing. Stephen turned to see that the doctor had joined him outside the ship. "Where are we, Doctor? I mean, I know what it looks like, but..." The doctor sighed. "I'm afraid that I think it's exactly what it looks like. Come along, let's make sure." He climbed out of the ditch with a little help from Stephen. "Thank you, my boy. Yes, look," he gestured with his cane. The slaughter of the trenches of the First World War was an image that had easily resonated down the 4 centuries to Stephen's time. He'd expected to see tentative heads keeping below the tops of the trenches, a deadly impasse. He hadn't expected to see the opposing forces mingling in the middle of no man's land, talking as best they could in spite of the language barrier, and sharing cigarettes. A sizable group, down in one of the dugouts, was the source of the singing that Stephen had heard. There was even a game of football taking place between the enemy trenches. "Christmas Day, 1914, the doctor said, before Stephen could ask. He didn't look at Stephen, but at the soldiers. "The 2 armies here have been attempting to destroy each other for months. Today, they changed their minds." He took a deep breath. "But tomorrow..." His statement shied away from the inevitable. "And I can't change that. But I should like to speak to them." He paced ahead. Stephen followed. Sarah left the TARDIS, chewing the last chunk of the nutrient bar that she'd stopped to obtain from the food machine. She climbed up out of the ditch. "Doctor!" she called. "Stephen!" Sarah surveyed the landscape, looking for her companions amongst the figures in the mud. She berated herself for not following directly after them. It didn't look safe out here, and she should be covering their backs. After a minute or two, she saw them. The doctor was talking to some of the locals, while Stephen had joined some of the men in kicking and chasing a spherical object back and forth. Sarah assumed this to be some form of ritual exercise. Relieved that they appeared to be safe, Sarah debated what she should do in the meantime. "Bang!" said a voice behind her. Sarah spun around to see a boy, no more than 8 years old, dressed in a uniform, like those worn by the men in this place. It was a little too large for him. The trousers were rolled up above his boots, and the tin helmet obscured his eyes. He brandished a toy gun at her. Sarah recognized him as the boy to whom the doctor had spoken in 1885. That shouldn't have been possible, though. He should have been much older by now. Perhaps, she considered, he simply resembled the other child. "Bang!" he said again, clicking the trigger of his toy. "You're dead." No, it was definitely the same boy. Even the voice was the same. Sarah crouched down to speak to him. "Hello," she said. She wasn't really used to speaking to children, so she tried not to make it sound too much like an interrogation. "Who are you?" "I'm Robert," said the boy. "Who are you?" "My name's Sarah." "Well, you're dead," said Robert. "Lie down." "I'd rather not," said Sarah, looking down. "It's very muddy." Robert looked at her sulkily. "All right, but you are dead. It's the rules." "All right," said Sarah. "I'm dead." "Robert, what are you doing here?" Robert ignored the question and looked at her clothes. "I remember you. I've seen you before in lots of places, but you didn't see me," he said proudly. "You're a soldier, aren't you? You're not like them," he gestured at the men on the battlefield. "But you're a soldier too." Sarah was about to reply, but Robert simply continued, "And this isn't your time. I learned about this time at school. The British are fighting the Germans. Who do you fight?" Sarah was a little taken aback by the boy's apprehensions. I fight the Daleks." She knelt down and asked again, "Robert, why are you here?" Robert smiled at her. "Because it's Christmas," he said. Then he vanished. "Very good, my boy. Excellent," called the doctor as Stephen performed a neat sliding tackle. The doctor had spent a little time talking to the soldiers, but their optimism made him uneasy. He didn't want to stretch his cover story, that he was a minister from the War Office, too far either, although everybody seemed too jubilant to question his presence. Instead, he had decided to watch the football. The doctor felt a tap on his shoulder. He started and turned to see that Sarah was standing behind him. "Oh, my dear young lady," he said. "Could you please refrain from creeping up on me like that?" "I'm sorry, Doctor," Sarah replied urgently. "But do you remember that boy we talked to in 1885? "Well, of course I do, but—" "Doctor, he's here. I've just seen him. And he was still a boy. He didn't seem to have aged at all." The doctor placed a hand on her shoulder. "What? Are you sure?" "Yes, Doctor. He recognized me from before." "But this is almost 30 years later. Where is he?" "Well, that's just it. He disappeared." The doctor sighed. "Good heavens, how remiss of you, letting him wander off like that. Space security agent indeed." "No, Doctor. I mean really disappeared, before my eyes. They didn't have transmats in this time, did they?" "Oh, no, my dear. They most certainly did not. It would seem logical to assume that he is travelling through time. And if he is, we can track him. But we must hurry." The doctor glanced over his shoulder. "Fetch Stephen. We must return to the TARDIS." Having changed out of his muddied clothes, Stephen returned to the console room. The doctor and Sarah were both staring at the scanner, which displayed the readout from the time path indicator. "How are we doing?" Stephen asked, joining them. "Have you found him?" "It's interesting, my boy," the doctor said. "It seems that we have not, in fact, been making random landings, but have been tracking a distress call from a timeship of some kind, and it has just left France in 1914, where Sarah saw our young friend." "And the TARDIS has been following the other ship to all these places without our knowing," said Sarah. "How?" The doctor looked abashed. "Yes. Perhaps the TARDIS isn't communicating as well as it should, leaving me to discover these things for myself. Yes." Stephen and Sarah exchanged puzzled looks. "What do you mean, Doctor?" asked Stephen. "What?" said the doctor. "Oh, never mind, my boy, never mind. The point is, this is a distress call, and I think we should answer it, don't you?" He returned his attention to the indicator. Our companion in the vortex appears to be landing." Robert had arrived in 1956, in a cold street in Manchester. He'd just been thinking about where he wanted to go when an elderly woman had stopped to talk to him. She'd asked Robert where his parents were. Robert had said that he didn't know. She'd asked him where he lived. "Nowhere, really," he'd said. The woman had given him a mournful look. Then she'd taken him by the hand and led him through the streets. The place she'd taken him to was full of children. Robert had been in places like this before. They gave food and presents to children who didn't have anybody else to give them those things. The kind old lady had given Robert a drum. Now he sat happily in the corner of the room, playing his drum, and watching the other children play party games. Christmases like this were his favourite. "Robert," said a voice he recognised. He looked up from his drum to see the soldier lady. The two men, the old one and the young one, were with her. He'd been expecting them to turn up soon. The old man stepped towards him. "Robert, is it? That's a fine drum you have there." Robert nodded. "You, travel in time. Am I correct?" "Yes," said Robert. "Yes," said the old man. "Who with? Who decides where you go?" "I do. There's just me," said Robert. "And where is your time machine? Could I see it?" asked the old man. Robert couldn't see any harm in showing the old man. After all, nobody had ever asked before. "All right." The doctor, Stephen and Sarah stepped back in surprise. It was difficult to describe exactly what was happening to Robert. He'd put his drum down. Then his face and chest had begun to open up. The space in the middle of him became wider as he slowly unfolded. Sarah had instinctively looked away, expecting the hole to reveal the boy's internal organs. On catching a brief glimpse, however, she realised that there was nothing in the space. It was all blackness. When it had stopped expanding, the blackness faded into an image of a small grey room. Sarah blinked. Edgily, Sarah moved to the boy's side and looked past the opening. On the other side, Robert was still there. Well, most of him, anyway. Sarah looked back to the doctor and Stephen. Stephen put out a tentative hand to the image. "Careful, my boy," said the doctor. Stephen's hand went straight through with no resistance. I think it's a doorway," he said. Sarah turned to see a middle-aged woman at her shoulder. Beyond her, the children had stopped playing and were staring at the time travellers and the strange doorway that had opened up where Robert had been. "Excuse me," the woman said shakily. Who are you? What are you doing? Don't worry, madam, don't worry, said the doctor, waving her away. We shall deal with this. He turned back to the doorway. What do you think, Doctor? Asked Stephen. Is it safe? The doctor put his hand to his mouth. Yes, I do believe Robert is the time machine. What? Said Stephen. You mean? Yes, said the doctor. He lifted his feet over the bottom of the doorway and stepped inside. Stephen followed the doctor, as did Sarah. Behind them, the door folded back up, leaving them in a small anteroom. There was another, more conventional door ahead of them, which the doctor opened. The three of them emerged into a room that was white and spacious. There was nothing inside, barring a large, transparent, cylindrical tank that emerged from the floor and reached up to the ceiling. There were a number of controls around the outside of the tank, but the observer's attention was immediately drawn to the figure inside, suspended in a light blue fluid. Wires trailed from the ceiling of the tank and had attached themselves to his cranium. The man was dressed in a kind of white, all-over body stocking, and his eyes were closed. He appeared to be in his late 30s, perhaps his early 40s. Sarah looked around. What? Is he a prisoner? She said, pointing at the man in the tank. No, said the doctor. No, I believe he's the pilot. I recognize the principle. He controls the ship with his mind. He moved over to inspect the controls. Do you understand them at all, Doctor? Stephen asked. Said the doctor. I can't be completely sure of them, of course, but I wish to speak to our friend here and establish why he sent that distress call. The doctor pointed to a switch that was picked out in red, and I believe this to be a release mechanism for that contraption. Are you sure? Sarah asked. If his brain is linked into that, you might damage him if you do the wrong thing. My dear young lady, I am entirely confident. And besides, I wish to get to the bottom of this. Stand back. He operated the switch. The three of them watched as the fluid drained from the tank. The man inside slumped against the glass wall. Then the tank retracted partway into the ceiling, the wires popping out of the man's head as it went. He was left, lying on the floor, taking juddering breaths as he regained consciousness. Sarah moved to his side. Without the distortion of the fluid, she realized that there was something familiar about him. Are you all right? She asked. Now, my dear, let's give him a chance to recover before we start bombarding him with questions, said the doctor. The man opened his eyes. Yes, Sarah. I'm okay, he said. Sarah was taken aback. How do you know my name? The man looked hurt. You told me it. Don't you remember? Sarah's eyes widened. He was 30 years older at least, but she could see this was the little boy she talked to in France. The one with the door in his head, Robert. She turned to the doctor. Doctor, what is going on? The doctor moved closer. So, Robert, why did you send the distress call, He didn't, said a disembodied female voice. I did. In the corner of the room, Sarah talked quietly to Robert, who was in a state of some confusion. Stephen divided his attention between those two and the doctor, who was holding a conversation with the voice of the ship. Naturally, the first thing the doctor had done was to ask Robert's ship how she worked. The pilot stands in the control booth, she said as though reading from the operator's manual. And his mind links with me directly. He can be sustained in there indefinitely. My exterior then alters to resemble the pilot, and the scanner feeds images and other sensations into his mind as though he was experiencing them firsthand. Ah, said the doctor. I suspected the principles of the control system, but to alter the exterior in such a way, that's very clever. Yes, very clever. So you're halfway between a vehicle and a sort of suit, I suppose.
Indeed.
And huddled in the corner, all Robert could think was that this was how he'd felt the day after Christmas. The day when Christopher, his twin brother, went away. He and Christopher did everything together, and they liked the same things. Robert knew that other children didn't have this, and he felt lucky. But in the months leading up to that Christmas, their house hadn't been happy at all. His mum had cried a lot, and his dad had been very quiet. Worst of all, Christopher hadn't wanted to play as much, hadn't been going to school, hadn't been doing much of anything. But they all had a really good Christmas that year, and Robert thought things were back to normal. It was like he'd been taught at school. Christmas was special. The next day, Christopher went away, and he never came back.
Who built you?
Stephen asked the time machine.
Where did you come from?
I was not provided with that information. They are, however, of a race significantly more advanced than Robert's. His brain is simpler than those with which I am designed to be compatible. So, why did you send the distress call? Asked the doctor. You've led us a merry dance, and I should hope for a good reason. I am an experimental model. During an early test flight, a fault emerged. When a mind was interfaced with my systems, neural feedback was generated, locking both the pilot and myself into a repeated pattern of responses. The pilot ejected before he became locked, leaving me adrift in the vortex. I landed on Earth, 16th of May, 1966. Dad left in the spring, and he didn't come back either. Robert asked his mum if he'd gone to the same place as Christopher. She shook her head, cuddled him tightly, and told him to be quiet. One Sunday, Robert came into the kitchen to find his mum in a weird position on the floor, lying very still. He wondered if she was asleep, but her eyes were open. One of the white bottles that she'd always told him never to touch was on the floor next to her, open. The pills spilled across the floor. All was silent, except for the radio. Confused, Robert decided to go outside and come back later. He knew that something was wrong, but he wasn't sure what to do. He went to his thinking place at the bottom of the garden. When he got there, he found a smooth white box. Robert looked over his shoulder, then opened the door.
Why didn't you warn him off?
Stephen asked. Standard procedure when abandoned is to shut down until recovered. By the time I was operational, Robert had already climbed into the control booth. My creators considered that it would be dangerous for me to be able to override the pilot. They did not, however, foresee the fault that had developed. Within minutes, the feedback locked us into a pattern that we have repeated ever since.
What pattern?
Asked Stephen. The box told Robert that it could take him anywhere that he wanted. Robert hadn't been happy since Christmas. Christmas was the only place that he wanted to go. With his mind locked like that, he never wanted anything else. I was aware of the problem but could not go against his wishes. I could only signal for help from outside. Stephen turned to the corner of the room. Robert was looking down at his body, bewildered. And with his mind locked, he never grew up, said Stephen. He still thought of himself as being a child. And so, whilst wearing the time ship, he still looked like one, said the doctor. He looks a great deal older now. You must have been waiting for quite some time. 32 years, 8 months, 3 weeks, 6 days, and 14 hours, said the time ship. I have damaged his natural development, The same may happen to somebody else if you leave me unattended. It would be safer if you destroyed me entirely."
"Oh, I don't think that will be necessary," said the doctor. "I'm sure that there must be some way of returning you to your point of origin." He tailed off into a mutter. "Something like a fast return switch.
"What about Robert?" asked Sarah. "What are we going to do with him?" The doctor turned towards Robert.
I don't know. I simply don't know."
The doctor stared at Robert for a few seconds, so to avoid suspicion, Robert stared at the floor. When the doctor turned away again, Robert looked up. He felt drawn to the old man's jacket pocket. No, it was something in the pocket. Whatever it was, he had to have it. Robert slid across the floor, away from Sarah, certain that nobody could see him. He reached up, lifted the object out of the doctor's pocket, and dashed back to the corner of the room, satisfied.
"What? Give that back this instant, young man!"
the doctor demanded, rounding on Robert.
What is that?
Asked Stephen.
What's he holding?
Whatever it was, Robert was holding it close to his chest.
"It's the terranium," the doctor said. "That young man has the terranium."
Sarah, who was closest to Robert, was the first to notice the ringing sound that emanated from his direction. "What's that sound?" she asked.
"My dear,
The doctor began, but broke off when he too identified the noise.
"I think it's coming from the terranium,"
Stephen said. This was borne out, as a glow also began to emanate from Robert's hands. Sarah stepped back. It was difficult to discern any change at first, but after a few seconds, Robert's skin had noticeably smoothened, and his figure had become a little gaunter. Then the change seemed to accelerate as he underwent puberty in reverse. His body shrank unevenly, eventually resolving itself into the form of Robert as they had first seen him, the 8-year-old boy who had first stepped into the timeship. Then, the glow and the ringing faded. Robert took his eyes off the core and let it fall from his grasp. Sarah picked it up. It seemed undamaged. Robert looked around. "Where are we going next?" The doctor asked Robert about his family and where he'd come from, then consulted with the time machine. Then he ushered Stephen and Sarah into a corner to speak to them.
"So what do we do, Doctor?"
Stephen asked.
"Try and get him back to his own time? Find a family who can take care of him?"
"A foster home, perhaps," suggested Sarah.
Yes, said the doctor. "That was my first thought too. But I think I have another idea. I must warn you, though, that it is a little ambitious."
"Go on, Doctor,"
said Stephen. The doctor grasped his lapels.
"The first Christmas on which we landed was 1965, the day before Robert's poor young brother passed away. Now, it also seems that the place on Earth where we landed was very close to Robert's home." He pointed at the central column. "This machine tells me that he would often choose to go there, due to its particular significance for him. Do you both follow me so far?"
Stephen and Sarah nodded.
"Good. Now, whilst I would not ordinarily be confident of getting Robert back to his exact time and place," he directed a stern look at Stephen, who affected an air of complete innocence, "I can use the fast return switch, which will return the TARDIS to each of its previous landing sites and take us back to Christmas 1965.
"And from there we could use it to go back to the year 4000, Sarah exclaimed, a little more loudly than she would have liked.
"I'm afraid not, Miss Kingdom," the doctor replied. "The fast return switch is not to be used lightly, and besides, it would return us to the precise time and place that we left. The Daleks would be upon us in no time at all."
"What do you mean it's not to be used lightly?"
asked Stephen.
"Is it dangerous?"
"It has malfunctioned before, and for that reason I try to avoid its use," admitted the doctor. He turned to glance at Robert. "But for what I have in mind, I think it will be worthwhile."
Robert had watched the old man send Robert's time machine back to where it came from. Then all four of them had got into the doctor's own machine. Stephen had told him to watch the big screen up on the wall, and whilst the doctor operated the controls, they'd watched 7 different Christmases fade in and out of view. An 8th appeared, and this, the one that Robert recognised better than any other, remained. A short walk later, and Robert stood in his own back garden once more. His home was exactly as he remembered it, except that it was the middle of the night, and he'd never been allowed up this late, and Sarah was standing next to him. She crouched down to his eye level. "You understand that we'd like to bring Christopher back," Sarah said, "but we can't." Robert nodded. "Because he was taken by leukemia." Sarah took a deep breath. "Yes. But you can make everybody much happier." She pointed at the house. "We've come back to the night that Christopher went away. Your parents are still there, and so are you. Now that we've brought you back here, there are 2 of you." Robert nodded. Then Sarah continued. "Well, why don't you pretend to be Christopher? You look just the same. Nobody will ever know." Robert did indeed remember. It was a strange idea, but if Sarah said it would work, then he believed her. "I could." The doctor walked out of the bushes at the bottom of the garden and joined them. "It's done," he said to Sarah. Then to Robert, "Has Miss Kingdom explained it all to you?" Robert nodded. "Good," the doctor told him, eyes twinkling. "It's a good thing that you're doing. Now Christopher has gone, you should take his place before your parents notice. You just remember 2 things. Don't climb into any more white boxes. And never tell anyone." Robert nodded, said goodbye, and walked back to the house. The next time he turned, the doctor and Sarah had gone. As Robert reached the back door, the kitchen light came on. Mum was in the kitchen looking worried. He hadn't seen her in so long, but he didn't show it. She let out a small cry of relief when Robert walked through the back door. "Oh, Christopher," she said, bending down to cuddle him. "I saw you weren't in your bed. Where have you been? You shouldn't be wandering outside." "I didn't feel well," Robert, now Christopher, replied. "I feel better now." In a few weeks, Christopher's parents would take him in for further tests, noting that his condition had improved. His doctors, having diagnosed Christopher's cancer as terminal, would be amazed to discover that it had vanished. They would beg the parents to let them study the child further, and be refused. Christopher, they would say, just wanted to go home and play with his brother.
But how can it work?
Stephen asked back in the TARDIS.
Surely now Robert never leaves in the time machine, so we never meet him and never take him back to 1965.
Robert has crossed his own time track, the doctor explained. He is changing history by replacing Christopher, and in so doing has become what you might call an anomaly, a remnant of a timeline that will now never happen. He shouldn't exist, the doctor spread his hands, but he does.
Right, said Stephen, still a little puzzled.
But isn't that changing history?
The doctor glanced at him.
In a manner of speaking, but...
Haven't you always said that we shouldn't? Not under any circumstances?
I have. But the intervention of the other time machine had already disrupted the natural path of causality. The doctor smiled slightly. Trust me, my boy.
Okay, Doctor. As long as you think it'll work.
Stephen gestured at Christopher, who lay on a small couch in the corner of the console room with Sarah at his side.
What about him?
We can't do much for him, I'm afraid, the doctor said sadly. He'll miss out on so much of life.
He turned back to Stephen.
I think he deserves just one grand experience.
And so, the last sight that Christopher ever saw was a dusty red landscape that was like something from one of his space adventure comics, only more so. The old man pointed to a light in the sky full of stars and told him that was the Earth, a pinprick that burned itself onto his eyes just before they closed forever.